Welcome back. Well, as we've already been hearing, the airline industry is already changing. Most people already know about the much vaunted A380 Super Jumbo. It's been billed as revolutionizing air travel. Meanwhile, this week, Russian plane maker Sukhoi unveiled the country's first new airliner since the fall of the Soviet Union. But the industry's also faced big problems. Angry demos greeted plans by Airbus to cut 10,000 jobs earlier this year. But Europe's biggest aircraft manufacturer claims orders from this week's Paris Air Show will help put it back on track. So, facing claims they're hastening global warmings, what are airlines doing to keep environmentally aware passengers? Well, earlier this month, one UK low-cost carrier, Flybe, announced it'll give customers data on fuel use, carbon monoxide emissions and the noise patterns of its planes. It claims this eco-labelling, the first of its kind, will let travellers make up their own minds about which airlines and routes to use. Well-intentioned or just a commercial stunt, and what sort of airlines will passengers be travelling on in the not-too-distant future? With us again to discuss that are our guests in Geneva, Anthony Consul of the International Air Transport Association, and in London, Joss Gorman from campaign group Plain Stupid. Thanks for being with us. If I could start with Joss, let's talk a little bit about eco-labelling. Do you think that represents a way forward, shifting the responsibility perhaps a little more towards the traveller?
No, I mean, this is sheer advertising. The Royal Commission on Pollution and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change have both said that we shouldn't expect significant technological breakthroughs for several decades, and they're basing that projection on industry's own figures. So really, whereas, for example, with energy or even with cars, there are some techno fixes, with aviation there simply isn't. And this is very misleading, and it's sending the wrong message to the general public.
What about, let's talk a little bit then about carbon offsetting schemes. How do they work, and will they become a standard feature of travel in the future?
Well, I mean, this is the idea that if you plant some trees somewhere, or if you put some solar panels on a roof of some school in Bogota, that's somehow going to have a magical effect on the atmosphere. But it has no scientific basis. This is the industry, again, making a quick buck out of people's genuine concerns about climate change. And really, the only way that we can reduce our impacts from flying is to fly less. And that's not as dramatic as it sounds, because so many journeys are very short distances, places reachable by train. And even some of the long-haul journeys are unnecessary and can be done through, for example, video conferencing.
All right, let's turn once again to Anthony. Does the trend of pressuring airlines to be more environmentally friendly, does that mean that air travel is going to get more expensive for travellers? I mean, it's already getting expensive because of the rising oil prices, but is that a trend that we're just going to have to live with?
Well, again, I think we need to take a step back. And when you talk about the trend of putting pressure on the airlines to improve environmental performance, we need to look a little bit at the industry's track record. If you look over the last 4 decades, airlines have improved their emissions and their fuel efficiency by 75%. We've reduced
prices
noise
are still
by an
going
equal
up,
amount.
aren't they, for your average ticket?
Well, the input cost, particularly the oil cost, is adding to the industry's cost base. But in general, if you look at the trend on yields, they're downward sloping, and travel is becoming much more accessible. Now, when we return to the debate on the environment and we say, well, where is all of this leading? I think we need to look at technology going forward. We recently had our annual general meeting in Vancouver, where environment was the #1 issue. I was at the Paris Air Show only yesterday, and everyone was talking about the environment and what the industry needs to do. We set a very challenging target and vision for the industry, which is to achieve zero emissions, zero carbon emissions. And some people say that this may be pie in the sky. Certainly the technology to achieve that does not exist today. But if you look at the building blocks that could possibly lead to that type of future, they exist. Alternative fuels. There's the possibility, and in fact people are making fuel from algae today. Biofuels that have no carbon emissions. Similarly, if you look at aircraft technology, a fuel cell aircraft will fly next year. A solar-powered aircraft is flying already. So certainly these aren't the answers immediately to our industry's future, but if we take a slightly longer-term view of the industry, zero emissions, I believe, is absolutely achievable.
But if perhaps we could engage with a point that Joss mentioned earlier, rather than grappling with all that technology, perhaps the traveller of tomorrow can just expect to fly less if there are other alternatives that are more cost effective financially for the traveller himself, as well as perhaps a little more environmentally friendly. Doesn't that make sense?
Well, again, that would be market forces determining that. But I'm assuming if you're going from Doha to Kuwait, your options are fairly limited. So what we need to do is to try and maintain the economic benefits of the air transport industry, which are $3 trillion, I should say, providing gainful employment to nearly 30 million people around the globe, and at the same time try and reduce our our environmental impact on the globe. And as I can say, the industry is absolutely rallying around that call, and we're moving forward.
All right, Joss, would reducing air travel really reduce carbon emissions, or simply increase reliance on other sectors which are, some would argue, just as bad, if not worse, in terms of pollution?
Well, in fact, I mean, trains are over 10 times less polluting. Even cars are 8 times less polluting. And so really, it definitely would reduce emissions. Even the Environment Secretary here, David Miliband, is encouraging video conferencing as an alternative to long business trips, for example. And between London and Paris, there's an amazing train route, Eurostar. And yet there's still around 60 flights a day between London and Paris, and yet the Eurostar takes you from the middle of the city to the middle of the city. It's more comfortable, it's often cheaper, and there really is no reason to fly.
But let's talk a little bit about perhaps some of the economic costs of adopting that sort of policy, which Anthony was mentioning there. Should we be prepared for massive job losses, for massive economic restructuring of entire sectors?
Well, I mean, at the moment in Britain, for example, there's a £17 billion a year tourism deficit because British people are taking their money and spending it in Spain. And so we've got the British government subsidising an Irish airline, Ryanair, for example, to take British passengers to Spain in American jets to spend their money there. So every job in Malaga is a job gone in this country from the domestic tourism industry. So it's not true to say that it's going to cause massive economic losses to Britain. In fact, it could actually prove to be beneficial to the British economy. And West London's become so dependent upon Heathrow, and that simply isn't sustainable. We have to look at the science, and we have to have policy that reflects the science and not the other way around.
All right, Anthony, a strong case made there by Joss for perhaps the economic benefits of restructuring our travel patterns. But would the developing world be hardest hit?
Hang on. Yeah, I mean, I think what we need to do is to move away from a British view of this problem. The air transport industry is a global industry. The environment issue is a global problem. So we need to find global solutions. So saying that we're going to lose jobs here, gain jobs there, move this here, move that there, is not really the best solution for the environment or for the industry, which is exactly why we need to move back to global standards and a global approach. If you look at air transport, we are the safest form of travel at this point, bar none. The reason for that is that we are governed by global standards and harmonization. When governments and industry agree and move forward in the right direction, we can achieve amazing results. So we need to take the same approach with environment, which is exactly why we're approaching the United Nations, the International Civil Aviation Organization, and asking them to come up with some guidance to push us forward on targets, challenging targets for governments and for industry to achieve on emissions, and at the same time explore a global scheme for carbon emissions, carbon emissions trading.
Sorry, I just want to quickly...
And also to explore the technological possibilities.
On a brief final point, Joss, the point being made there by Anthony is perhaps that governments should bear some of the responsibility. I mean, right now the EU and US are potentially arguing over whether the EU's imposition of target emissions might conflict with international aviation rules. Doesn't something need to be done amongst governments themselves?
Of course it does, of course it does. And you know, the science says we have 8 to 10 years left to halt irreversible climate change. We've got the development agency Christian Aid predicting 182 million people could die in Africa this century alone because of climate change. The World Health Organization already saying 160,000 people a year dying from climate change. Yes, we need the governments to act, but we don't have time to wait for the US to come on board. We need governments to be taking unilateral action.
I'm sorry, we are running out of time, so we'll have to thank our guests, Anthony Consul from the International Air Transport Association in Geneva and Joss Garman from Plain Stupid in London. Thanks. both of you, for joining us. Well, that's about all we have time for, but just a final thought before we do go. The A380 Super Jumbo, the world's biggest ever aircraft, capable of carrying 800 people, is due to come into service, we're told, later this year. Well, it can't land at many airports yet. The runways just aren't big enough, and each one costs $300 million. At this week's Paris Air Show, one man placed an order for the jet for his own personal use. $300 million that, according to the Disasters Emergency Committee, could feed nearly 500,000 families in Darfur for a whole year. Thanks for watching, and do stay with Al Jazeera. For now, it's goodbye.